Hello, it's Lou Garrison with part 3 of week 9 for the module dealing with health technology assessment. In part 1, we looked at the definition of health technology assessment and the principles of health technology assessment, noting that there was many times the processes focused on medicines. In part 2, we talked about the emergence of HTA in emerging markets and low and middle income markets. Again, noting the importance of medicines and the focus on medicines. In part 3, I want to drill down a bit and look more closely at medicines, and in particular branded medicines, given their importance in healthcare delivery in general, and talk about some of the pricing principles, which you'll recall was kind of the third part of health technology assessment. In this part, I would like to cover 3 related issues. First is the economics of drug development, focusing on innovative medicines, the relationship to that with incentives for innovation, and then just a couple of slides on thinking about what value means. That's something that you've focused on from the beginning in looking at cost effectiveness. So I want to offer the idea that there's maybe a broader perspective that we need to consider as well. The focus of most of the discussion in this part will be on prescription medicines, and in particular branded prescription medicines that are still on patent. A lot of the times that will be implicit in what I'm saying, but that's what I'm thinking about, that we will also discuss generic medicines. From an economic perspective, it's useful to ask the question, well, how do these drugs differ from other goods? What makes them unique in medical care, and so on. There's a famous article from over 50 years ago by Nobel Prize winner Kenneth Arrow that says that the main thing that drives the differences of medical care as a unique sector, the healthcare sector, is uncertainty. Uncertainty in many dimensions in terms of product quality, provider quality, outcomes, and so on. So uncertainty is at the top of the list that makes medical care somewhat different, and certainly it characterizes a lot of the institutional features we see in medical care. Certainly many other goods have uncertainty, but if you go down this list, and I won't go through each one in detail, it's the combination of all these things that make this sector particularly challenging, interesting, and unique. Informational asymmetry is referring to the fact that basically patients are experts on themselves, and providers are experts on medical treatments, and they're engaged in a principal-agent relationship, with the physician being the agent and the patient being the principal, and so there's informational asymmetry problem that needs to be solved. A post-experience good is a peculiar good in that even after you've consumed it, you may not be sure whether you've got a good quality care or not. For example, in medical care, so that would probably be something you would recognize. There's a lot of regulation, so that becomes a barrier to entry. Administered pricing means that the government often sets prices for medical services. That's true in our diagnosis-related group hospital system, the physician payment system in the United States, and prices for medicines are fixed in Europe after they're launched. High fixed costs when it comes to medicines. Basically, it just means that it costs a lot of money to develop a medicine, and we'll talk about the estimates of that. A large part of the cost is failed medicines. Once a medicine has been developed, particularly a small molecule, it's very low marginal cost to reproduce it. So, but there are also the marginal costs, not just to produce it, but also to distribute it. The intellectual property issues, the patents that apply here will have a different effect than they would in software, for example. There's high risks. It's a high risk. Most products that begin through the pipeline don't make it through. And the idea of blockbusters is that some products become very profitable with revenues over $1 billion a year, and in a sense they fund all of the research. And then finally, the product, it takes anywhere from 12, 15 years to develop it, and then it's got a patent period follow on. So these are all factors that make prescription drugs different from some other economic goods. It's also useful to ask the question, what is a medicine from an economic perspective? Economists like to talk about the health production function, where health is a function of inputs such as physician visits, hospital care medicines, patient's own time, and other. And I highlight the other because really it's those are the social determinants of population health, like lifestyle and diet and so on. And when you look across geographic areas, other is probably the most important in explaining health differences. What is an innovative medicine? Well, it represents new information or knowledge. And what's unique about new information? Well, that means it's not a private good; it's a public good. Information can be used by other people, and I certainly mentioned this previously. So, and not only that, it's a global public good. Okay, so those are the factors that make medicines unique. If you've taken an economics course, you may have heard of the concept of market failure. The economist way of thinking is to start out with a simplified model, and in the particular case, a perfect competition, and show that basically they're in a perfectly competitive market with lots of competition. There are many good outcomes, and in general, we would expect optimality to prevail in terms of things being produced to where marginal benefit equals marginal costs. In situations where there are barriers to a perfect market, such as public goods, externalities such as pollution, economies of scale, those are situations of market failure. Now, in the case of medicines being public goods, free markets without any sort of incentives would tend to undersupply these. So we intervene. How do we do that? Well, we intervene in two ways. We patents, intellectual property, rewarded to medicines and other innovations, but we also subsidize the production of development of some medicines, for example, orphan drugs. So that's what we're in market failure, and the response to market failure is an important part of the story here. In the previous slide, I mentioned the patent system as an incentive, intellectual property as an incentive for rewarding innovation. And this applies not just to medicines, but to all types of innovations. And in response to the sort of public goods nature of information and the sort of incentive to be a free rider, to counteract this, we've established a patent law and defined a patent life, which is now generally agreed to be 20 years around the world. The thing that's unique about medicine, say compared to computers or other types of patentable innovations, it takes 8 to 12 years on average to launch the product from the time of the patent is initiated until it's launched. So 8 to 12 years. That means if you have a 20-year patent life, you have 8 to 12 years remaining to after approval to do marketing and sales. So you can imagine there's a lot of pressure to realize all the returns you can in that period. Now, the patent does provide strong protection, but it is not perfect protection against competition. Generic copies, simple copies of the molecule, are blocked during the patent life. However, competition is allowed. What are sometimes called Me Too's or follow-ons are often drugs in the same class that can have a different benefit risk profile, and those are certainly competing. So there can be competition during the remaining patent life of the first entrant. So it's not a perfect protection. This slide's based on an excellent article or chapter by Morton and Kyle in the Handbook of Health Economics. And they summarize the key characteristics of the market for pharmaceutical products. First of all, it is a research-intensive industry. To launch a new product requires meeting requirements through the in terms of large clinical trials, randomized controlled trials, usually two trials that may cost tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars each. And then there's a lot of research that doesn't pan out that we'll talk about. So very research driven, and the innovation is based on that. At the same time, given all the uncertainty that was mentioned, there's extensive regulation of all aspects of the testing of the drugs in early in animals to patients, on to the clinical trials and so on to launch, on to promotion. That's all regulated by national regulatory agencies. Prices are also regulated, and these can have unintended global consequences for access that we'll talk about later. Again, in terms of industrial organization, there's considerable heterogeneity in firms in size and strategy. There are some large firms that have quite diverse portfolios, and there are many very small startups that are focused on a particular innovation or medicine. It's a competitive marketplace. We see lots of acquisitions. We see horizontal mergers across large firms, and we see vertical specialization in disease areas and aspects of the drug development process. I don't want to spend too much time on the U.S. Food and Drug Administration because we're really talking about national regulatory agencies, but the company must file a new drug application or a biologic application. The Prescription Drug User Fee Act, adopted in 1992, allowed the FDA to charge fees. This led to reductions in review times, but also speeded things up and increase in reported adverse events. A key legislative change was the Hatch-Waxman Act of 1984. That was essentially a deal that allowed generic entry. Off-patent drugs can file for an abbreviated NDA based on bioequivalence, and this has applied historically to small molecules. Trials were not required, and then they could enter the market. Now the regulation was and the entry was regulated, so that during the first 100 days there could only be one generic enter the market. So you'd have a competition of we'd have a situation of a duopoly of two competitors, and later on we'll see what happens to price in a duopoly situation. But the U.S. is less regulated when it comes to the generic side of the market. Other markets often regulate generic prices. This slide about the economics of pharmaceuticals highlights three salient economic facts. I've made these points before, but they have more authority coming from Joseph Newhouse, professor at Harvard, who's been one of the leaders in the field here for over 30 years, and he's editor of the Journal of Health Economics. He highlights three economic facts. There are high fixed, what are called sunk costs, relative to the marginal costs. So, after the drug has been launched, all those costs are sunk. They can't be recaptured, and the production just requires marginal costs. So that's a unique situation around pharmaceuticals. They have a temporary legal monopoly. We talked about the remaining part of the patent life, and developing drugs is risky. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and somewhere between 80 and 90% of products that begin in development in phase 1 do not make it through the pipeline. So there's a lot of risk involved for the manufacturer and then for the health system in general. This slide emphasizes the point about drug development being complex, risky, and costly. The little diagram to the left is showing that there was in order to make an estimate of what it costs, you would need to estimate the probability of making from phase 1 to phase 2, phase 2 to phase 3, and to the marketplace eventually. And there have been a number of estimates of the average cost of doing this. Again, maybe only 20 to 25% of the drugs that are reached testing in humans make it to the market. Now, the Office of Health Economics, where I did a sabbatical in 2012 and 2013, did a study that I wasn't involved with and reviewed the literature and estimated that the average cost per new approved medicine was $1.5 billion. Interestingly, last fall, Joseph DeMasi at Tufts University updated the methodology that he had developed 10 years ago and came up with a new estimate of $2.6 billion. And there's been a lot of controversy around that, but I think it's clear that whether it's 1.5 or 2.6, it is a large number, and that does reflect the fact that there are many failures and that that drug development is complicated, risky, and costly. This slide from the Food and Drug Administration shows the approvals of new molecular entities, so small molecules, and new biologic entities, so larger molecules, complicated molecules, between 2004 and 2013. And I think the thing that surprises most people is that the numbers actually approved are far below 50. In fact, the average over this period was about 27. So we're only talking 27 products a year. Not each of them, not every one of them are fantastically unique. Some of them are follow-on compounds in a given class, and so on. So these are very scarce commodities that are expensive to produce. And again, they're global public goods. So I think it's important to keep that in mind in thinking about how unique they are. You would see a similar curve in Europe because the products are approved in the U.S. and then are also applied for filing in Europe and approval. It's important to realize that the whole idea behind the patent system is essentially to offer a prize to the innovator, and we're essentially financing the innovation by granting someone a monopoly. Normally in markets, we have antitrust provisions and we try to prohibit monopoly because we know that monopolists will charge higher prices than we would observe in a free market. With higher prices moving up the demand curve, fewer customers or fewer people will receive a product. So there's a trade-off. That's the trade-off in monopoly. In the short term, results in less access. In this case, in the case of pharmaceuticals, and in other innovations, we grant these monopolies to get innovations, but we put a limit on them, and so we're trying to limit the prize, and we're more or less successful in some situations. But there is a trade-off here between what you could call dynamic efficiency, which is the optimal rate of innovation, and access or equity. High prices, either in the U.S. or high prices in the U.S. relative to other countries, or in Europe relative to other countries, mean that affordability is a problem, and some people will be denied access, and it will be inequitable in the short term. So there's a trade-off there. Now, Joe Newhouse basically says we're in a second-best world. We need to recognize that we have a market failure. We're trying to correct that with patents. And we're trying to develop the second best situation, a dynamically efficient price that would balance this trade-off in an optimal fashion. So that's what you can think of the patent system as an attempt to approximate that. The purpose of this slide is to sort of convey the idea that there are risks to both sides of the market, to the manufacturers and the payers, and the kind of relationships that they engage in through negotiation results in a kind of equilibrium. I've already emphasized that the risk to the manufacturer is that that they're looking for blockbusters to finance all of the failures that they have. It's important to note that no one agrees to pay the manufacturer for a failed compound. They're only rewarded if the innovation succeeds in the marketplace. At the same time, the payer faces some risk. The payer has to negotiate a price based on the limited information that's available from the clinical trial program. Now, they could change that over time in principle, but in certain jurisdictions that price is fixed. So the payer bears the risk of making a bad buy, where the incremental health benefits are not worth the additional cost. Now, payers are free to collect data post-launch. In general, we see we have public good problems here as well, and we don't see health systems doing a great job at collecting comparative effectiveness research information. Now, in this general equilibrium, different countries have tried to resolve this in different ways to strike different types of deals. Some control prices of pharmaceuticals, some negotiate, some have free pricing. There's a wide range of solutions, all trying to figure out how to limit the monopoly power of the short-term monopoly power of the manufacturer, while getting as much access to the medicine as they can for their patient population. You are probably aware that the pharmaceutical industry has witnessed decades of mergers and acquisitions and consolidation, so that there are a smaller and smaller number of the large firm players, which suggests that not everybody can stay in business. It's a competitive situation, and although it's a general profitable business, some people don't make profits and they go out of business. In the most recent analysis from Professor Berndt of MIT, published in the journal Health Affairs just this year, they looked at the after-tax net returns for novel active substances by the launch cohort. And what they found is, and you can look at in general, the after-tax net returns have been falling, and they fall into the negative range in the most recent period for which they have data. All of which is indicative of a challenges that the industry face, and that that's it's not clear what the future will hold if these trends continue. Although I've been focusing mostly on patented innovative medicines and branded medicines, it's also I also mentioned that eventually at least small molecules have gone off patent and generic entry is allowed. This graph is fascinating and useful because you can see that it sort of fits just what economic theory would suggest. And this talks about what happens to the relative price as there are more and more generic entrants. And you can see in the duopoly situation where there's only one competitor, the first generic, they basically shadow the price of the of the original compound, so 94% versus 100%. Once you go to two competitors, then the price of the generic falls on average to 52%. And then you can just see the broad trend is the more and more competitors there are, the more and more the price that relative to the branded price falls. Now, this also tells you, and as we know, that the marginal cost of making a drug is small relative to the price, and that's we understood that from the initial layout of the discussion. But this does illustrate that there are going to be potentially great savings as drugs go off patents, and we have witnessed this in recent years. The next few slides summarize the economics of the biopharmaceutical industry, speaking both about biologics and pharmaceuticals. And they're really drawn from excellent article in the Oxford Handbook by Patricia Danzin, who's a professor at Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. And so she highlights, I think, identifies key characteristics. It's regulated. There are high globally joint fixed costs. So everyone, the joint costs, the fixed costs of R&D are essentially global, and everybody bears these. Okay, and you can't separate them out by region. It's a joint thing. And the low marginal costs. Patents are essential for people to recoup their R&D investments. Defining appropriate prices is a challenge. It's not obvious exactly what the optimal patent term would be. Given in the short term that there's high profitability, there's certainly a strong incentive to try to promote and sell the product. Consumers, patients in this case, in some sense their sensitivity to price is undermined because they're covered by insurance and they have a physician who's prescribing as their agent, and they're sick, so they have inelastic demand. They want whatever will help them get better. So those are some key characteristics, and she has some others that I'll cover in the next two slides. Continuing with some key features of the industry, I've mentioned the informational asymmetry. Again, there's also, because we're insured, that we make different decisions that we make if we didn't have insurance. So this leads to what's called moral hazard, which means we would consume more than we would otherwise. And so insurance companies basically need to try to control that. In the U.S., for example, the main strategy around pharmaceuticals is to have tiered formularies so that different drugs have different co-pays, or co-insurance, to direct consumers and incentivize consumers and doctors to use them. The global nature of this R&D, this global public goods aspect, raises questions about who's going to contribute to this reward innovation. In a sense, we all benefit from it. How much can different countries contribute? People in different systems, and so on. Countries have an incentive to free ride and to essentially not contribute to R&D. And so, if they can get a low price and let somebody else pay a high price, then that's fine from the country's point of view. So again, it takes so long for this stuff to develop that you don't immediately, if you contribute, you don't see the returns immediately. So again, there's an incentive for free riding. Now we'll talk later, and Professor Danzin has written a lot about this, on the principle of differential pricing, which makes sense and from the standpoint of people contributing to R&D based on their ability to pay, but this is difficult to implement in practice, and we'll talk more about this. Here's a final slide reflecting some of the features noted by Professor Danzin. Again, the ability to for companies to price discriminate across countries is undermined if, for example, Brazil says they want the same price that Colombia gets, so that they're using external reference pricing, so that they're looking across borders. So or if a richer country cites a poorer country in terms of the price that they want. That undermines the ability to do differential pricing. Again, most of these markets eventually become oligopolistic with slightly different products and differentiated competitive products. Regulation is due to uncertainty. On the insurance side, the moral hazard. In thinking about products and pricing, it's important to recognize that not all patients are identical. Heterogeneity of patient response is important, and the fact that medical care is expensive and people have insurance for it means that the physician prescribing, third-party payment, the insurance are key factors in generating kind of a lack of demand elasticity and giving the seller essentially more market power. This slide conveys kind of the simple basics of pricing. And the basic idea, and this is more from a marketing perspective, is that there is some perceived value of the product, and that basically the customer will be comparing that to a reference price of another product and asking, well, how are you different? What's the perceived differentiation? So there's a reference price, and you can think of this in the incremental cost effectiveness ratio as the current standard of care. And I'm saying, well, what things make you better? Do you have better outcomes? That would be a positive differential value. On the other hand, suppose you have a worse adverse events profile. That would be a negative differential value. So you can sort of think about that's how value is kind of simply thought about by customers in this market. This is a very interesting table from the Morton and Kyle article. And I'm not going to discuss every one of these columns in detail, but I think you can see that it's more complicated than you might think. So if you look on the very first column, the price of a price index relative to U.S. prices. So if U.S. is 100, then looking at manufacturers' price at exchange rate, the U.S. would be having a higher price than most of the countries, with the exception of Japan and, interestingly, Mexico. Okay, and we could speculate about why why sometimes we see that some of the middle-income countries have higher prices than the U.S. And then you could sort of say, well, we need to adjust for exchange rates, and you see a similar pattern that alters the relative prices some. We should look at public prices at purchasing power parity, and we can normalize by income. When we normalize by income, we see that places like Canada are actually, at least at this time period, were paying slightly more than the U.S. France was paying the same, and so on. At the same time, Japan was paying a lot more, but Brazil, Chile, and Mexico were paying, in relation to income, much higher prices than. Now, my argument would be that was probably due to just a weak negotiating power and not getting that organized. But for originator drugs, single source drugs, and that's maybe a key column, the U.S. pays the most, and certainly it's at least a stylized fact in the industry that people recognize that the U.S. probably picks up at least 50% of the profits that are generated by the industry. So funds about 50% of drug development, really, from a global perspective. You can see the generic prices column, they're all over the place, and this reflects the fact that the U.S. is low because we have an unregulated generic market. Other markets have regulated and administered pricing. So it's a complicated picture. It's not simple. In general, wealthier countries pay more, but there are some important exceptions that sort of indicate that the market's not functioning well globally. I have mentioned differential pricing as something that the economists would regard as desirable, and that Professor Danzen has advocated it. And there's a piece on one of the required readings is a nice piece by her about the sort of justification for differential pricing. Now, parallel trade, in a sense, is what would kind of undermine differential pricing. If you can sell it, if a company were to sell goods cheap in in say Greece, and they were resold in Germany, people in Germany bought them, then then a company could not maintain a price differential between Germany and Greece, which in general is the situation in Europe, that there is free movement of goods in parallel trade. So essentially the price differences get arbitraged away. Now, at the same time, pharmaceutical companies behave strategically. I think what she's saying here, the low marginal cost, they basically try to of the producing the medicines. They try to protect their patents. They try to create a web of patents. There have been deals to try to keep generics from entering. So there are in a situation with powerful rewards, you can expect profit-seeking pharmaceutical companies, and most are, to try to essentially garner what the market will bear in the short term. And they also we can also see that some of this behavior in terms of formulations that are not particularly innovative in terms of extended release or over-the-counter. This is sometimes called evergreening, which is a way for them to try to protect their revenue stream. But the point of this slide is parallel trade essentially undermines our ability to do differential pricing. This graphic and map essentially shows the pattern of differential pricing. This is a bit dated now, but you can see, for example, that Finland, in negotiating prices with manufacturers, looked at the price of the Czech Republic or the price in Germany. Japan was looking at the U.S. price on the left. Canada was looking at the U.S. price. Very complicated web. The basic problem is if everyone is looking at other people's prices and saying, I want a lower price, then essentially it's a race to the bottom. So the obvious incentive for companies would be to maintain one high price and not differentially price if countries are going to play that game. And that result in choosing a higher price for everybody means that they're going to be, the poorer countries are going to have greater access restrictions when they would actually be better off, with affordable prices that could guarantee more access for their citizens. Comparing prices across countries is not as straightforward as one might think, because first of all, different formulations and different packaging are sold in different countries, so they're not strictly comparable. So the table that we saw from Morton and Kyle was actually relatively straightforward, but it also just realized the complexities in terms of adjusting for exchange rate, purchasing power parity, originator, and so on. So there's a lot of complexities here. It makes it more difficult than you might think to do international comparisons. Yet it is clear that large price differences exist, and that there are also some anomalous prices where some low-income countries have relatively high prices. Now, I recommend the article by Danzen, but there was an earlier piece with Danzen and Towles that's available on the internet that basically says we should do differential pricing, and they have a scheme called Ramsey optimal pricing, which is a kind of differential pricing named for an economist that basically says that that the prices you charge in different markets should depend on the elasticity of demand. Now, differential pricing can be difficult to maintain. The monopsony purchasers, and we see countries like Australia, South Korea have a lot of purchasing power. They're essentially a monopsony, single buyer, negotiating with the monopoly, the single payer, and they exert their power. Countries use reference pricing to negotiate. So, in a sense, everyone's trying to get the lowest price, which undermines kind of a fair distribution of prices across countries. Reference pricing then also has, affects the launch sequence. I mean, obviously, if people, if Taiwan were looking at South Korea's price, then a company might want to think about whether they launch in Taiwan first or South Korea first. The bottom line is, you might think that promoting price transparency would be a good idea, but if it's being used for reference pricing, then actually it can end up harming patients. This is a picture of the first page of the article that I mentioned and put on the required reading list from Professor Danzen, published in 2007. Really lays out more straightforward terms what she and Professor Towles wrote about in 2003, which is also available on the internet, but it's a much more mathematical treatment, but the same basic argument. And you can see the first line: differential pricing could make global medicines affordable in developing countries. Differential pricing means charging different prices in different jurisdictions, countries, or regions within countries for the same good, for the same medicine. Profit maximizing, price discriminating monopolists would practice this based on willingness to pay. They would try to assess the elasticity of demand in different markets, and would try to prevent parallel trade and charge different prices in different markets if they could. This is the standard case. You may remember, if you took some economic theory of a perfectly price discriminating monopolist, would essentially result in a use level, an aggregate use level that's close to the social optimum in terms of marginal benefit equals marginal cost. So nearly everyone in the world who would get the medicine in a free market would also get it, but the monopolist would earn large profits. And we rationalize that the profits as a reward for innovation, though there certainly are a number of skeptics in the world who wonder about the long-term viability and usefulness of this approach. But I'm not going to go into that. But there are certainly some critics that are worth looking into to sort of understand some of the limitations of the system. We have seen that the existing system, which is not really is only loosely differential pricing, it's actually a complicated web of regulation and sort of unintended global interaction, can result in very high prices in lower income countries, that in situations where pharmaceutical companies would be quite happy to sell at lower prices if they could prevent parallel trade or stop external reference pricing. So I think we need to recognize that we have a big trade-off here. It's the same trade-off we see in monopoly in general. If we grant a monopoly, we give this reward for innovation. We can promote dynamic efficiency in terms of a higher rate of innovation, but it can affect access or equity of access in the short term. So monopoly. So the trade-off is having more drugs in the long term versus higher prices in the short term. But in the long term, if the medicines aren't invented, then no one can access them. So that is the dilemma we have, and we don't have a perfect solution yet. I personally think that differential pricing would help us get closer to that, but at the moment we don't have a regime proposed or in the works for differential pricing. To end this section again with a couple of quotes from Professor Danzen, whose position I support. Differential pricing would go a long way towards making drugs that are developed for high-income countries available and affordable in developing countries while preserving incentives for R&D. Differential pricing is economically efficient. It would support this. It's also consistent with standard norms of equity, meaning that those who have more should contribute more to cover the costs of the fixed cost of the global public good. This doesn't mean that the system is going to address issues like neglected diseases for which there's no return, which are focused primarily in low-income countries. So we need other interventions to address issues like that. So next, I'm just going to wrap up with a couple of slides on the concept of value. I hope that you all will recognize this formula from the earlier presentations by Professor Baba Gemira. This is how we traditionally think about value in healthcare, using the incremental cost effectiveness ratio, with the numerator being the difference in cost versus the standard of care, and the denominator being the difference in outcomes. We measure cost in monetary units, and outcomes can be measured in various ways depending on whether you're talking about cost utility versus cost effectiveness and so on. But generally the preferred and recommended metric is the cost per QALY. That's been the preferred metric, the quality adjusted life year. And there's also the disability adjusted life year, which is an alternative, but I think similar idea to the QALY. So next, that's our fundamental concept of value. So next, and I would just point out that in the cost in the numerator we're talking about the incremental costs, right? So that if the product costs more, if there are cost savings, those will be cost offsets. So we're talking about value as a function of incremental QALYs and cost offsets. This is my final slide for Module 9, and I just want to reiterate a number of things here. These are not things I've talked about before, but I hope that they will sort of stimulate your interest to realize that we all still have a lot to learn about this, and there's room for improvement and improving our methods. Now, as an economist, I would define value as what fully informed patients would be willing to pay. Usually they make that payment by insurance. So, you might ask me the question, well, what would I be willing to pay in an incremental insurance premium to have heart transplantation covered in my plan? That would be certainly one measure of value. Well, what we advise in most of our methodology is that value, what I should be willing to pay, should depend on whether there are any medical cost savings or cost offsets. Do I gain any life years? Number 2. Number 3, do I improve my quality of life or lower my morbidity, which we combine into the QALY? So those are the 3 core things: health gain and cost offsets. 4th thing we talk about is productivity gains, saving me time, and so on, and that's what comes in from the societal perspective. Those 4 have been the traditional measures of the field. Increasingly, when we move to things like personalized medicine and diagnostics, we're starting to look at some other dimensions, one being reduction in uncertainty. So by a personalized medicine, if I know I'm going to benefit, that makes something more valuable to me. I should be willing to pay more. So the QALY doesn't capture that. Many of our analyses focus on the typical patient, but in number 6 we're saying we also need to look at aggregate value in a population in terms of adherence and uptake. If more people use the product and benefit, or if they're more adherent, they get better outcomes. Those are value gains from the system point of view. There's also something coming out of finance theory called option value, that when I survive, it gives me an option to benefit from future advances. So in some sense, I would be willing to pay for that. So I would value that. There's also an interesting literature developing on something called the value of hope, that people are often willing to accept risk for substantial gain. So in an end-of-life situation, I might be willing to take a toxic therapy, relatively toxic therapy, if there is a say 10% chance of a cure or longer game. So those are just some ideas of things that are not usually captured in the metrics that we should think about when we're developing policy and doing analyses. Another one I don't have on the list, I think falls under reduction in uncertainty, is what's called financial risk protection. Once something is brought into the insurance plan, I can get a peace of mind by knowing that I'm covered against catastrophic illness, for example. So that's another factor. And then finally, scientific spillovers, and this is not something that necessarily that an individual would be willing to pay for directly, but we all recognize that inventions open the doors for other inventions from a scientific, technological point of view. And so the more of those we have, the more chances that we're going to have spillovers, and we all benefit from those. So in some sense, we should say, well, we should put a little bit more money in the system to sort of support the potential for spillovers. So in thinking about HTA, and when we're thinking about value, I'm just saying that and even in the UK in the last few years, they talked about value-based pricing. They talked about how could they measure some of these other things in thinking about the resources that they devote to healthcare. So thanks. Let me stop with this slide and do one more slide. Okay, we've reached the end of the HTA module, week 9. I hope you found these 3 components useful and interesting, and look forward to any questions that you have via the internet. And or if you need any articles or anything, feel free to email me, and I'm happy to follow up. And good luck with the rest of the course. I hope that you've found the entire course useful and stimulating. Thank you.